to Dom Erik Varden. Welcome to our cathedral and thank you very much for being here with us. Nós temos a alegria de ter entre nós o Sr. Dom Erik Varden. O Sr. Dom Erik Varden é de Trondheim, na Noruega, que é uma pequena diocese em termos de número de católicos, mas de um grande território, e é bispo desde o Covid, mais ou menos, portanto, nomeado ali em 2019, 2020, mas foi monge durante 20 e tal anos e abade numa abadia em Inglaterra, porque foi aí que se converteu ao catolicismo, depois de ter sido batizado protestante, encontrou a sua fé católica, em parte, como ele conta, ouvindo a segunda sinfonia de Mahler. E por isso a música, a arte, a cultura, a beleza e a fé e a maneira de olhar para Jesus Cristo e para a Igreja, mas também para o homem, sempre esteve na sua reflexão, que tem vindo a partilhar com o público, o mundo, não só pelos livros que escreve, mas também pelos sites e pelas redes sociais, como agora se diz. Por isso nós temos muita alegria em ter o convidado para vir cá e ter aceito de vir cá, a comissão do jubileu da nossa diocese, que assim também se enriquece com este gesto. O Sr. Patriarca acolheu esta nossa proposta com entusiasmo, porque também o Dom Erik já falou aos padres da Diocese de Lisboa, à distância, mas fez-nos uma belíssima conferência há quase 2 anos, há 1 ano e pouco, e que foi muito marcante, de onde também depois surgiu a proposta sobre a vida espiritual do padre, de onde depois surgiu a proposta de um livro, de um cartucho sobre a oração, e por isso tenho sido também de uma ajuda e conhecido aqui pelo clero da nossa Diocese, e hoje é a ocasião também de abrirmos não só ao clero, mas a todo o público. O Sr. Dom Erik já cá tinha estado, mas desta vez aqui na Catedral também, e no ano do jubileu, é para nós uma grande alegria. Por isso agora pedi ao Sr. Patriarca que desse início à sessão e depois ouviremos com agrado. Sr. Patriarca.
Olá, muito boa tarde. Eu começo obviamente por agradecer e dar as boas-vindas em nome da Igreja de Lisboa a Dom Erik. É com muita alegria que nos reencontramos num momento tão significativo, não só para a vida da nossa Igreja, como da vida do nosso Patriarcado e também da vida do mundo, onde realmente somos convidados a revisitar esta obra preciosa e maravilhosa que é o ser humano, e daí que é o homem, para que vos lembreis dele. Bem-vindo, em nome de todos nós, bem-vindos também a vós, caríssimas e caríssimos. Acorremos à Sé Patriarcal, que é o lugar da celebração, mas é também o lugar do aprofundamento da vivência e do aprofundamento da nossa fé. De facto, desde que o Salmo elevou ao alto aquela oração, que é o homem para que vos lembreis dele, a história tem-nos mostrado que a resposta que a própria Sagrada Escritura dá, por vezes torna-se difícil fazer a passagem das páginas da Sagrada Escritura para as páginas e para o acontecer da história. Às vezes há aqui uma certa ruptura, porque este mesmo homem, quem é ele para que vos lembreis dele, é caracterizado com elevação, com grandeza, com dignidade, com majestade, e no entanto as páginas da história, ao contrário daquilo que é afirmado nas páginas da Bíblia, as páginas da história por vezes contradizem um pouco essa elevação, essa dignidade, essa majestade do próprio ser humano. Eu agradeço ao Dom Erik ter-se deslocado a Lisboa, porque certamente ele vem-nos encaminhar, vem-nos guiar para descobrir que essa grandeza do ser humano é feita de dignidade, de respeito e dignidade do homem, pelo homem, é feita de uma vocação que não se limita a ter no acontecer e na realização histórica, digamos, o seu objetivo, mas que transcende, é um ser em transcendência, é um ser que vai para além do tempo, que vai para além do espaço, porque animado de uma vocação à santidade, uma vocação à elevação de Deus, e depois é o único ser consciente de que em relação ao seu semelhante não é apenas um parceiro, não é apenas um da mesma espécie, mas que somos irmãos e que somos irmãs. E daí brota e se canaliza a justiça, a liberdade, a fraternidade. Obrigado, somos todos ouvidos, e oxalá que a reflexão e a partilha que faça esta noite, ela se transmita e se comunique a toda a sociedade. Obrigado.
Thank you very much to all of you for being here. Thank you to the Patriarch for his most gracious and kind welcome. It is a joy for me and an honor to address you in this venerable space. So, what is man that you should be mindful of him? That's what I've put as an introductory title to my subject, which is how to work and hope in a time of civilizational crisis. What is man that you should be mindful of him? The verse comes from a psalm in the Psalter, the 8th psalm. It's a text which is about 3,000 years old, and it is good and humbling to remember that for all this time, human beings, men and women, have reflected critically and quizzically about the sense of who they are. So the question is not a new one, but it is a particularly urgent one in our time, when man, so it would seem, has such an overwhelming sense of being forgotten. And when man, to a surprising extent, seems himself to have forgotten who he is, what he is, where he comes from, and where he's going. For several years, we have seen in the West a surging of apocalyptic imaginings. Books and films and television series have for years evoked the scenario of a shattered world, of fractured relationship, of a society brought to an end by some massive calamity. Some of you may have read Cormac McCarthy's rightly famous and dystopic novel, The Road. Some of you may have seen the film based on that book, which portrays a humanity struggling to establish itself afresh in a sort of a post-nuclear landscape. That work of art is emblematic of this genre of the apocalyptic imagination, a highly literate and therefore deeply haunting expression of it, but there is no shortage of banal regurgitations. And what is interesting is that we are hungry for these apocalyptic imaginings. We lap them up. We watch them on Netflix. We go to the cinema and we buy the books. And why is that? Well, I think because these films, these books, these series touch some deep presentiment which is alive in us and touch some latent fear. That presentiment and that fear is increasingly being articulated in public discourse, more patently in terms of a civilizational shift. It's become current to speak of a world order coming to an end, even to speak of a world coming to an end. Does it make sense to speak in those terms? Is it licit? Is a world coming to an end? If so, what is the world that is ending? To put that question in a framework, I think we can say that in effect, the notion of a world coming to an end, of a world perishing, is the drama of every deathbed. Origen of Alexandria, the great 3rd century theologian, had a notion that each human being is a microcosm, a minor mundus, a reasonable and contemplative agent posited within the macrocosmos of the created universe in order to behold and contemplate that universe, to reflect it, and to seek to understand it, and to enrich it with his experience, his imagining, his thoughts. When such a thinking subject dies, when a human being leaves this world, it is true to say that a world dies with it. That's an intuition which is echoed in much romantic poetry, and that we will have encountered when facing the death of someone we loved, and suddenly realize, perhaps with anguish, that a whole world of memory, of seeing and experiencing the real, is gone and no longer accessible to us in this world. From a Christian perspective, this understanding of each human being as a world destined to live on this earth for a while, then to leave it, prompts a view of death as something to be practiced. Such a perspective invites us to enable a gracious leave-taking from this earth, a leave-taking that will not be excessively painful and grievous to others. And it invites us to form death itself into something gracious. We have, in the Christian tradition, the notion, the very valuable notion, which is strange to our modern secular society, of the ars moriendi, the art of dying. The idea that not even our life, not just our life in this world, but even our departure from it, can be formed and molded into a work of art, is an extremely suggestive and beautiful one. So death to a Christian is not something we should be excessively fearful of. As Christians, we know that death is integral to life, and also that death is never final, because it has been vanquished once and for all in the resurrection from the dead of our Lord Jesus Christ and the renewal of our humanity. So that's a Christian perspective on a world coming to an end. In current discourse, in the sort of pieces we read in the newspapers, or the sort of speeches we might hear on the radio or on the internet, the sort of world we envisage or imagine coming to an end points to something rather different. It points to a bleak collective experience of loss, untouched by hopes of resurrection. What we're presented with, what we're often told is happening, is that a civilization is dying, a form of life. There may be something to that observation, but before we address that, let's ask ourselves, what is a civilization? When thinking of that question, personally, 3 associations come to mind. The first association is not a very devout one. It comes from an absurd and comic film made in 2016 by an Italian director called Checco Zalone, who also plays the main part in this film, a film called Quo Vado? Where am I going? It describes the life and career of an Italian bureaucrat who has one dream and aspiration in life, which is to obtain un posto fisso, knowing that once that is done, he can enjoy a life of leisure and be assured a good pension. So that's the extent of his aspiration. But he falls out with a boss in his office who wants to remove him as far away as possible as an irritant, so sends him to the end of the world, which is to say, to Norway. So you can imagine the comic potential of the disgruntled, disappointed, exiled Italian bureaucrat sent up to the land of perpetual ice and darkness. He thinks it's terrible to begin with, but then he's fascinated by this country where everything seems to work and where everything works on time and where people are obsessed with order. There is a wonderful scene where Checco Zalone queues in a post office, a very, very long queue. And when he comes to the counter and the official at the post office asks, "What can I do for you?" he simply says, "Oh, nothing. I just needed to have the experience of being in a queue that leads somewhere." And he begins to imitate these strange patterns that he is observing. And his mother, who comes to visit from Italy, is deeply troubled when she finds that not only does he do his own cooking and his own laundry, but that he started ironing his laundry, including his socks. So from this point of view, because a refrain that goes through this part of the film is, vivere in un paese civile, to live in a civilized country. On this account, civilization is about good order, working trains, things functioning as they should, cleanliness and predictability. It's not a sufficient view, but it's one that I think is fairly currently shared. I won't tell you how the film ends in a disappointment with this model of civilization, but you'll have to find that out for yourselves. So that's one model of what civilization might mean. Another model that's made me very thoughtful, I discovered in a documentary film I watched a couple of years ago about the Bukovina, that region in Eastern Europe, which is now divided into several countries, Ukraine, Romania, etc., that had a rich civilization of its own, largely German-speaking, that was consistently and comprehensively destroyed during the Second World War. In this documentary film, there is a striking interview with Erwin Chargaff, who was professor of biochemistry at the University of Columbia in New York and a pioneer in DNA research, who was from Bukovina and from Czernowitz, the capital of the Bukovina. And he speaks of what life there was like between the wars. And he says to the interviewer, "It was very civilized." And then he corrects himself and he says, "No, it was cultured. The bathrooms were in a worse state than the bookshops." So that's another perspective on civilization, a place where material comfort and good order has a priority over spiritual, intellectual pursuits, or at least where intellectual and spiritual pursuits presuppose a good surrounding order, where no one would bother to read a book unless he had a functional bathroom. But I'd like to pause a little longer on a third approach to civilization, which is also from a visual medium, from an extraordinary production made for English television in 1969, a series written and designed by a man called Kenneth Clark, who was the director of the National Gallery in London in the 60s. The series, which you can find on YouTube, is called Civilization, A Personal View. In the first episode of that series, Kenneth Clark speaks of European civilization as a bulwark defining worldwide, at least to the West, what human life and human society can rise to. He sits and talks about this, and then he asks a rhetorical question in a very English sort of way. He says, "What is civilization?" And then he answers his own question, again in a very English sort of way, saying, "Oh, I don't know. I can't," he says, "define it in abstract terms. But," he says, "I recognize it when I see it." At which point, the camera lens expands, and you see where he is sitting, tidily wearing brown tweeds, and he finds himself on the bank of the Seine River in Paris, and behind him rises Notre Dame de Paris. So the message is that is civilization and a measure of it. And when you sit there, at least when you sat there in 1969, that seemed like an impregnable fortress, something inviolable that couldn't be destroyed. And we might have thought that ourselves until it burned not so long ago. But the point Kenneth Clark is keen to make in this series is that for seeming extremely solid in its monuments, civilization, Western civilization, European civilization, Christian civilization, is in fact something quite fragile. He says civilization can be destroyed, you know, and he says it almost happened once when the barbarians ran over the Roman Empire. He says, and this seems to me quite a true statement, he says, for 2 centuries, the heart of European civilization almost stopped beating. We got through the crisis, he says, by the skin of our teeth, only just. Now, he says, speaking in 1969, 7 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, now we have an uneasy sense that it could happen again. People had an uneasy sense in 1969 that civilization could collapse. It seems to me that that sense is now an anguished reality in our own life and perception at so many levels. So it's worth pursuing Clark's reading of civilization and its enemies. He says, however complex and however solid civilization might seem, it's actually quite fragile. What are its enemies? he points to two enemies above all, and they're interesting because they might not be what you would expect. He says, the first enemy of civilization is fear. The sort of fear that makes it seem worthless, not worth the bother, to construct things, to make beautiful things, to plant trees, or to have children. That's the first enemy of civilization on this reading, fear. And the next enemy? Boredom. The feeling of hopelessness, which, says Clarke, can overtake people with a high degree of material prosperity. The sort of boredom that the fathers of the church called Arcadia or Achadia, a kind of latent depression that just leaves you thinking that there's no point in putting any effort to anything, that everything is prospectless, that makes you feel weary and worn out and overwhelmed by tediousness. Fear and boredom, two impulses that are very much alive, it seems to me, in the Western world right now, in a Western world forgetful of its origins and having quite lost the compass which might indicate a way into the future. Our fear now in the West is manifold. Ecological fear, economic fear, political fear, strategic fear, and existential fear. We're conscious that the poles are melting, that the sea level is rising. We see how drones flying over our airports can, in a flash, lame our infrastructures, or how a power cut can paralyze entire nations. And we're faced with the extraordinary and fascinating, but also terrible prospect of artificial or digital, or if you like, inhuman intelligence, uncertain what that will do to us and our societies. As for our boredom, it seems to me congenital. It is extremely hard to mobilize and confederate people now for any kind of positive purpose. It would seem that only reaction, often reaction prompted by anger, can now mobilize human beings to collective enterprise. Our current discourse is hugely marked by identity politics. Rarely, it seems to me, at least in the countries known to me, by an intelligent, articulate, constructive notion of a civitas, of a common good and a common city to build up. The tendency in politics now in the West seems to me to be almost universally a tendency of disaggregation, of exploding unities. We also have the fact that Europe statistically simply is not reproducing itself. And we are faced with an extraordinary civilizational phenomenon which baffles sociologists and psychologists, which is that often labeled now as asexualism, of young people just opting out of desire. There is frenetic construction in our cities, that is true, but who now builds anything which is intended to last for 50 years, not to speak of a century? It would seem that there is in our society something like an implicit collective death wish, which finds outward expression in the consistent sidelining of the family as a unit of no current relevance, and the increasing rationalization and advocacy of so-called assisted dying. So that's what we're facing from within, something which is rather new for Europeans and a bit humiliating, which your patriarch pointed to in a probing and an extremely interesting article just a couple of months ago, is that the sort of ennui we feel from within in Europe is now confirmed from without. Just the last few months have seen geopolitical discussions going on over our heads as if we just weren't worth consulting, even about our own future. High-placed politicians from other continents have asked publicly whether Europe has a future and whether there's anything left here worth defending. We have been asked whether we ourselves have something we really think worth defending. And that's an uncomfortable question, because it reveals a very hazy sense in our society now of the common good. Inquiries in many countries revealed that young people now, to a large extent, are simply not prepared to wage war for their country. Why should they? Any resonance now of the Latin poet Horace's famous dictum, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, idealizing a patriotic oblation for the nation, for the patria, which after the First World War was denounced by the English poet Wilfred Owen in a searing poem, is now a claim that seems to many people, young and not so young, plainly absurd. Why should I stand up for my nation? What's my nation to do with me? Indeed, what prospect and what confederative potential is capable now of galvanizing our continent and saving our civilization? Such mobilization as there is seems to take place, as I've already noted, in view of an anticipated menace. And we largely take it for granted that an enemy is at the gate, that we are under threat, that extinction is a real prospect, that it might all just come tumbling down. We simply can't make up our mind whether to put up a show of resistance or whether just to surrender. But can one live well on such terms? We tend to assume now, that seems to me an aspect of very much current discourse, that our circumstances in the world, in the West now, Anno Domini 2025, are conditioned by so many utterly new factors that no previous experience is of any relevance. And so we gladly cede to a collective forgetfulness and an amnesia. And so it is helpful to find, to attend to listen carefully to past voices that may actually have something extremely important and revealing to tell us about what we're going through now. And so I'd like to read to you a poem by a Greek writer, a native of Alexandria, Konstantin Kavafi, a text written in 1898. It is set in the form of a dialogue from a late antique Roman village, two people in a village talking to one another at exactly that period that Kenneth Clark refers to as that in which the heart of European civilization almost stopped beating, where the enemy is at the gate and everyone expects the end to be near. So we have two people talking to one another, one asking questions, the other giving answers, until at the end there is a kind of denouement, which is a bit disturbing. Some of you will know this poem. I should like to read it to you. So one person asks, "What are we waiting for assembled in the forum?" The other person replies, "The barbarians are due here today." "Why isn't anything going on in the Senate? Why are the senators sitting there without legislating?" "Because the barbarians are coming today. What's the point of senators making laws now? Once the barbarians are here, they'll do the legislating." "Why did our emperor get up so early, and why is he sitting enthroned at the city's main gate in state, wearing the crown?" "Because the barbarians are coming today, and the emperor's waiting to receive their leader. He's even got a scroll to give him, loaded with titles, with imposing names." "Why have our two consuls and praetors come out today, wearing their scarlet togas? Why have they put on bracelets with so many amethysts, rings sparkling with magnificent emeralds? Why are they carrying elegant canes, beautifully worked in silver and gold?" "Because the barbarians are coming today, and things like that dazzle the barbarians." "Why didn't our distinguished orators turn up as usual to make their speeches, say what they have to say?" "Because the barbarians are coming today, and they're bored by rhetoric and public speaking." But then, why this sudden bewilderment, this confusion? How serious people's faces have become. Why are the streets and squares emptying so rapidly? Why is everyone going home, lost in thought? Because night has fallen and the barbarians haven't come. And some of our men, just in from the border, say, there are no barbarians any longer. And then the poet leaves us with a question. Now, what's going to happen to us without barbarians? Those people were a kind of solution. I find that text uncanny, and I think it provides a clue and a sort of hermeneutic key to much of this apocalyptic imagining that surrounds us and often seems to absorb us. So what's a Christian response? How can we live and work and hope at such a time? As I said, the poet Kavathis' text presents a poetic vision of the civilizational near-collapse that we've heard Kenneth Clark refer to. And it reminds us, and that's extremely relevant for us now, that a civilization's principal enemies come not just from without. Much more insidiously, the enemies of civilization spawn from within in stagnant waters that are unstirred by passing angels, waters in which there is no healing to be found. In fear and in boredom. And so we should be extremely wary of powers that manipulate our fear and exploit our boredom. The tendency to which Kenneth Clark refers is manifest in the epoch of the Great Migrations, which, as you know, lasted a very long time. He speaks of 2 centuries. But I think it is licit to represent this age, this time at which the beating heart of civilization almost ceases, in terms of a symbolic moment, a kind of crossing of the Rubicon, a foray or a transgression, a decisive event after which things are no longer the same. And I think a legitimate candidate for such a symbolic moment would be Attila's victory at Utus in the year 447, which enabled the Huns' invasion of North Italy and the material destruction of the remains of Roman civilization. So, Attila's victory at Utus, the year 447, a blow for Western civilization. A generation later, in North Italy, a man was born whom we today honor as the patron of Europe, Saint Benedict of Nursia, or Norcia, born in the year 480, and who was to die in the year 547. Now, when we think of St. Benedict, and when we think of Benedictine monasticism, well, we think of civilization. That is civilization, for goodness sake. We think of our monasteries, our churches, our schools, our precious manuscripts, our traditions of learning. And I'd say that the civilizing effect of a Benedictine monasticism is doubted by no one. But did Saint Benedict, born in 480, a generation after the Huns' invasion of North Italy, in the midst of civilizational collapse and general destruction, did Saint Benedict set out with a civilizing mission? Did he advertise and self-publicize a Benedict option? Did he sit down at his desk and say, look, people, this is what we need to do in order to rescue this project? Of course he didn't. He was a man, quite simply, who believed in Christ's promise. A man who believed that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, and that death, therefore, is dead. Who believed in the forgiveness of sin, and who therefore also believed in the possibility of reconciliation among people, and who on that basis believed in the possibility of a new kind of society based on justice and benevolence and compassion. Saint Benedict's mission was evangelical and Christocentric. And what is interesting is that that mission was pursued in the revealed certainty that what he was building up would not materially last. What do I mean by that? If you've ever been to Monte Cassino and have gone in to the cellar, the most ancient stratum of the monastery, you will come into what is, according to tradition, St. Benedict's cell. And you will see there a mural which depicts a vision St. Benedict had in a dream when he was busy building up the monastery of Monte Cassino, one of the great monuments of the West civilization. And what he saw in that vision was that Monte Cassino, his life's work, what he was spending his life building up, would be torn down shortly after his death, precisely by the barbarians. Did that cause him to assume the attitude of Cavafis village dwellers? Not for a minute. Not for a minute did he stop building, because his enterprise was conducted on other terms. What he was concerned with principally wasn't a material monument to himself and his agenda. What he was concerned with was the manifestation in the world of his time of the mystery of God, the manifestation in that world of the gospel commandments as realizable and life-giving, and of the firm re-establishment in human self-understanding and in the concept of society of a vertical axis to complement the horizontal one, creating, of course, a cross shape that is the Christian key to self-understanding in this world. So the project, the Benedictine project that generated and affirmed the civilization that formed Europe as we know it still, was the eruption within a tremendous chaos of an ordering inspiration born of hope and concretely embodied in individual persons and individual communities. An inspiration that was perceived and lived out as a source of courage and hope and joy and creativity and the sheer worthwhileness of living. That inspiration was drawn from a firmly held and a collective sense of purposefulness, on a conviction that our lives, our world, our relationships, our societies, the body politic, and my own incarnate body means something and has a durable, even an eternal worth. That is a civilizational movement that teaches us and shows us how to live and hope at a time of civilizational crisis. I like to think of this Christian movement, and I've referred to St. Benedict because of the coincidence with that time of threat to civilization, but the Benedictine movement is emblematic of a tendency and a trend that repeats itself at intervals, happily, in human history. I like to think of this movement as one that enabled a culture of creative subversion in the soil of an ancient and tired civilization. Creative subversion, that's what I believe in. Let me try to define those two terms. Culture, we heard Ernst Schargaff say in that quotation I started with, can be something to do with bookshops, with learning, with reading, with passing on competence and knowledge and poetry. And that is true, that is one aspect of culture. But the word culture, cultura, has a primary sense that refers to an assisted growing and thriving of living things, which refers to a cultivation of the land by which Adam, the earth creature, drawn from the fruitful Adama, assists the fruitful land emerged from arid wastes that were a moment ago at the bottom of the sea, and enables that earth to produce a wonderful variety of flora and to constitute an environment of thriving. So culture, cultura, has got an intellectual dimension, but also an extremely practical dimension, which is that of assisting the earth in its purpose of fruitfulness, of nurturing the earth, which will also mean at times just feeding it with dung. The notion of subversion, which isn't a particularly reassuring one in current vocabulary, but if we look at that too in its radical sense, it fits into this semantic landscape of agricultura and horticultura. A dictionary definition of subversion suggests that it represents the undermining of the power and authority of an established system or institution. And that's how we used to thinking of subversion, as an impulse for anarchy, an activity pursued for purposes just of deconstruction. But literally, if we pursue the Latin root, we find that subvertere has an original concrete meaning which is much more interesting. Subvertere means to turn underneath, even as convertere means turning round, and revertere means turning back. So a subversive movement is the sort of movement that plowshares produce when they work the soil from underneath, turning a layer of soil upside down and thereby rendering it apt to receive fresh seed where, just left unplowed, it would have been an unreceptive, baked surface hardened by the sun and by the passage of feet and beasts and men, where seeds, as in the gospel parable, if they were sowed, would have no depth of soil and so be scorched by the sun, have no root, and be destined to wither away. So creative subversion of culture, could that not be a Christian task for the present? A Christian spiritual reflourishing, when we look at 2,000 years of church history, does have a curious way of emerging from times of civilizational precariousness and breakdown and epochal change. And we find in Christian history a sort of holy bloody-mindedness to the ploughman's subversion. We see this pattern repeated again and again. We see it in the Benedictine movement in the 5th century, which I've already referred to. We see it in the work of great missionaries like Alcuin and Boniface in the 8th century. We see it in the great monastic renewals of Cluny and Citeaux in the 11th and the 12th century. We see it in the mendicant movement in the 13th century. We see it in what has often been called the mystical invasion of the 17th century, when in the wake of religious war, there is an extraordinary reflourishing of Christian sanctity and Christian thought. We see it in the monastic and devotional movement of the 19th century in the wake of the revolutionary movement, and we see it in the movement to the sources ad fontes after the Second World War that prepared the terrain for the Second Vatican Council. And why shouldn't such a movement happen again, now? And do we not, in fact, see signs now that a new, still fragile, but nevertheless perceptible, Christian flourishing is beginning? What are the dynamics of that flourishing? I spoke of St. Benedict's purpose of establishing a vertical axis, of showing by explanation and example that there is a necessary and vital connection between earth and heaven. And that only in a transcendent perspective can we human beings find an adequate answer to the question from which we set out, what is man that anyone should care for him? So the terms of renewal are an awareness, a reawakened awareness of God's transcendence, beauty, fascination, and absolute priority. As the great French mystic and monastic founder, Madame Barbe Acari, said in the 17th century, in a phrase which became a sort of motto, trop est avare à qui Dieu ne suffit. He for whom God is not enough asks for too much. Then, a radical fidelity to the gospel and a confidence in the gospel commandment. St. Benedict summed that up in his rule in the axiom, prefer nothing, but nothing at all, to Christ's love. Then a renewal of cultic worship, a liturgical reflourishing, an interest in prayer, in learning to pray, in teaching others to pray, the fascination and the beauty and the nurturing nature of prayer, and then, crucially, in a culture of hospitality. St. Benedict, in establishing his monasteries, established little units that were materially self-sufficient, but with porous boundaries, and where strangers were always welcome in. In fact, one of the key officials in a Benedictine monastery is the porter at the gate, who is instructed to remain in the porter's lodge, and for that reason St. Benedict said he should ideally be an old man so that he's not tempted to go too far, because his task is to be there at the gate awaiting the poor people who might come. And when the poor present themselves, he is to exclaim at the first knock, Deo gratias, God be thanked that you're here. And then he is to say, benedicite, your blessing, having the consciousness that even the poorest pilgrim and the most resourceless visitor will have some wealth to give and to partake. Christianity, let's remember, is not just a proposal for self-improvement or moral rearmament. Christianity speaks to us of the possibility of a life, and thereby of a world, that is transformed and given a new sense in Christ, the divine Logos, become flesh in order to reanimate our flesh from within and make it capable of eternity. On these terms, the Church has again and again caused dying embers of civilization to burst into new flame, turning the apparent decline of a world into a new beginning and changing dusk into dawn. The human being, and so human society, is awakened thereby to the stature, the freedom, and the beatitude we are equipped to reach, but about which most of the time we totally forget, not remembering what we are, that God, our neighbor, and we ourselves should be mindful of us. The Christian Catholic vision is not a utopian vision, nor is it necessarily an optimistic vision, but it is a resolutely hopeful vision. And Christian hope is no vague atmosphere just of assuming that everything will turn out all right, because not everything always turns out all right. Christian hope stands for the certainty that everything means something, that everything can have a purpose, that even wickedness and evil and sin can have a purpose that can be turned to good, and that can be turned to serve God's providential purpose of salvation. This hope is illumined by charity. This hope looks upon the world with compunction, assuming responsibility for our own wrongdoing, but desiring the world's salvation and yearning for the redeeming of each woman or man in it, in order that, as St. Paul writes to Timothy, in order that all may be saved. That must always be the Christian's programmatic statement. And this is an extremely helpful corrective to the often inflamed rhetoric that we hear now and again these days, that a Christian now must first of all try to save Western civilization, to do what we can to maintain this monument because it is our pride and our joy. Last year in New York, the Irish writer Paul Kingsnorth gave a lecture which has been much commented upon with good reason, which bore the rather provocative title, Against Christian Civilization, by which Kingsnorth didn't mean to say that Christian civilization should just be dismissed, but in which he insisted that we cannot instrumentalize faith to maintain a product of faith. To refer again to the monastic movement of the 5th century as an example of Christian subversion of culture, the early monastic settlements didn't cut themselves off from the world to construct a different sort of world. They carried the whole civic order into their prayer and compassion and remembered on the world's behalf foundations that the world had largely forgotten. And so these subversive Christians became bearers of lost treasure, so that on this basis, remembering the sense of things, it might constitute itself afresh, always extending a gracious and kind welcome when the world turned up on its doorsteps. This trend is generative, and it's not for nothing that in monastic literature we find constant reference to spiritual mothers and spiritual fathers, reminding all of us that our task and purpose in life is to become life-givers for others, whatever our state of life. And that sense of generativity, of life as something worth passing on, is a criterion of Christian authenticity and is exactly what our weary, self-centered age now is often indolently lacking. So how does Christian culture exercise its subversion? By submitting the soil of the present moment to the plowshares of Christ's promise, by believing in that promise and in the life-giving power of Christ's commandments, by confronting the depth of self and self's pretension, by repenting of the ills of our time while seeking at the same time to repair those ills, by bearing one another's burdens in charity and sympathy, and by spreading abroad, like the 72 disciples first sent out in the gospel, by spreading abroad Christ's peace, which the world simply cannot give, but for which the world is hungry. For that purpose, patience is called for, and readiness for battle, but above all, hope and confidence in Christ's saving purpose, which is for the saving and the sanctification of the world. Our world, not a make-believe world. And that's why I think the notion of civilizational crisis, which I put in my title, and with this I will conclude, this is why I think the notion of civilizational crisis is helpful. A dictionary definition of crisis, in most of our language, I think, will say that a crisis is a time of intense difficulty or danger. That's how we most commonly use it. But if, again, we take the trouble of tracing this word back to its root, its Greek root, we find that it means much more. In Greek, a crisis, a krisis, is above all a moment of decision, a moment that calls for intelligent discernment and resolve. The root of crisis comes from krino, which means to form a judgment. That's what we need to do now as Christians. We need to form a judgment, a discerning judgment about the state of our times and our mission in it. The hope we offer the world is rooted in Christ's victory over sin and death, a victory won once for all and rooted in history 2,000 years ago. But what turns this hope into good news, evangelium, is the realization that what was accomplished then in the past is unfolding now, is real now, is sacramentally enacted now on our altars, and is calling out to be realized in Christian lives. For we, as members of the Church, are the agents God is pleased to employ for the realization in the present of his plan to save and to sanctify the world, and to show the blessed potential and significance of existence at every level. Precisely what society now has forgotten so largely, the potential and significance of existence at every level, from the most sublime and intellectual to the most carnal and embodied. Our duty, to sum it up, is to pursue the call to holiness, which is to foster the life of Christ in us and to let that be fostered. And let's remember that the call to pursue holiness is not an optional extra. The universal call to holiness is, I would say, perhaps the most essential, foundational principle of the Second Vatican Council, presupposed in all its other teachings. When we're told in the grandiose constitution of the Church, Lumen Gentium, in paragraph 42, that all the faithful of Christ are invited to strive for the holiness and perfection of their own proper state. Indeed, they have an obligation to strive for holiness. Let all have care to guide aright their deep sentiments of soul, to guide aright our sentiments. Let neither the use of the things of this world nor attachment to riches hinder them in their quest for perfect love. Let them heed the admonition of the apostle to those who use this world. Let them not come to terms with this world, for this world, as we see it, is passing away. It is soil waiting to be plowed to bring forth a harvest for eternity. The awareness that it is possible to live like this, that this is what God readies us for, that's what gives us confident hope and peace in the midst of great perplexity and even in the midst of objective danger. We must take a stand against the fatalism of Cavafis village dwellers, whose outlook is mirrored by the musings of many a contemporary commentator in our media. As Christians, we believe in the constant possibility of an eruption within life as it is, with all its dullness and pain. We believe in the possibility of an eruption within this life of a more intense form of life, a life at once glorious and familiar, at once awesome and joy-bearing. And there are seeds hidden in the soil entrusted to us, seeds that will bear fruit if the soil is worked well, creatively subverted. That is the hope we move towards, and towards which we invite others under the motto of this Jubilee year, Peregrinantes in Spem, moving into hope. Does it seem to you that the people of our time are deaf to the message we carry? Well, if they're deaf to what we say, show them what your hope is. The great Cardinal Ildefonso Schuster, Archbishop of Milan, said on his deathbed to a group of seminarians in 1954, "It seems that people are no longer convinced by our preaching, but faced with sanctity, they still believe, they still kneel down, and they pray." Peace I leave you, says our Lord Jesus Christ in words we repeat at every Mass. Peace I leave you, my peace I give you. Let us bring that to the world. I will end with something that was said of Abba Anthony the Great, the founder of monasticism, a friend of the Patriarch Athanasius in the 4th century. 3 fathers used to go and visit Blessed Anthony every year, and 2 of them used to discuss their thoughts and the salvation of their souls with him. But the 3rd always remained silent and did not ask him anything. After a long time, Abba Anthony said to him, "You often come here to see me, but you never ask me anything." And the other replied, "It's enough for me to see you, Father." That is testimony to a truly Christian life, a Christian existence in which the Son of God is alive and life-giving. May the same be said of us. Thank you.
Então, em nome de todos vós, eu acho que a palavra que surge e que aflora os nossos lábios é obrigado, thank you very much, grazie mille, merci beaucoup, gracias, porque de facto Dom Erik desafiou-nos com uma interrogação, que é o homem para que vos lembreis dele, e quando o homem se dirige a si próprio, esta possibilidade de se dirigir a alguém com uma interrogação semelhante acerca de si, mas dirigida a um outro, naturalmente que não está apenas a desenvolver uma prerrogativa típica do ser humano, que é aquela de questionar e de se questionar. Mas mais do que isso, torna-nos verdadeiramente peregrinos, caminhantes, mendigos de uma caminhada e de uma viagem. E foi essa viagem que Dom Erik nos acompanhou, nos guiou e nos conduziu na descoberta, afinal de contas, do ser humano, mas sobretudo na sua dependência direta de Deus. Obrigado. Obrigado porque escutamos o pastor, escutamos o terapista, escutamos o homem de cultura, escutamos o europeu, que para nós é motivo e matéria abundante para nos reforçar na caminhada rumo à santidade, realizando assim aquilo que é a nossa vocação por excelência, que é aquela de sermos construtores de um reino maravilhoso, a exemplo e à imagem de Jesus. Obrigado. Thank you.